Hello class, hope you're doing well. Today we are going to review Chapter 3, and Chapter 3 is the African Americans and the Criminal Justice System chapter. And what we're going to review is a lot of things about the history of African Americans and how it relates to the criminal justice system. So again, make sure you read the chapter. If you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the discussion board for all to see, or else shoot me an email if you have any questions about this. But make sure you read the chapter because this is just an overview of what the chapter talks about. A lot of good stuff in this chapter. So to begin with, what is the historical background of African Americans? When the statement separate but equal came out, is that true? Think about that for a second. Were then African Americans separate but equal to their white counterparts? Or is that true today? What do you think? Separate but equal. Always been a controversial statement around the history of slavery and after slavery. So we're going to move on, but just think about that context. As far as slavery, there's a lot of history per the book and other research. Basically, some slave ships came from Jamestown, Virginia, on a Dutch ship from the Netherlands and other countries with enslaved Africans. And therefore, they came to the United States and were then used as slaves for many years because African slaves, as opposed to other types of slavery of different people, were cheaper. And indentured servants were different than slaves. Indentured servants came over on a contract from different countries. They were not enslaved, but they would work for the person that owned the land for a certain number of years, and then eventually they would be released from their servitude after 5 or 7 years. Different from being a slave. Slaves had no rights. They were not ever released after working for a few years. As we know from history, Nat Turner led the most brutal slave rebellion in history that killed many people, blacks and whites. And that was in 1831, not that long ago, that occurred. Moving on with slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and issued January 1st, 1863, which basically said that if the Union won the Civil War, that would mean the end of slavery in the United States, which did occur. So that was kind of a big day. Actually, it is a big day in our history about the Emancipation Proclamation. So on December 6, 1865, 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified that outlawed slavery. It's still in the books. So again, a lot of things occurred as far as slavery went. But ever since 1865, there's been a struggle between separate but equal African Americans and others. So talking about the post-slavery era, the book does a good job talking about this, about the Reconstruction period, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. We're going to have a whole class on that and probably a movie that shows what the KKK is all about and how they were anti-black. They're still out there today. There were some black codes that were enacted that basically restricted the limit of freedom that African Americans could have. So again, even though slavery was abolished, there were laws that limited what African Americans could do. We'll talk more about those in a little bit. So slavery was not definitely over, but it was kind of modified just a bit, as we'll find out. So beginning in the 60s, this is where the separate but equal treatment came into play. And what's interesting is this, in this photo here, you have a white drinking fountain and a colored drinking fountain. So they separated many different things: bathrooms, bus stops, buses, schools, as colored and white. So if you look at this and look through history, you see the white fountain right here, just a random picture. It's kind of nice, it's tall, it's got, a spigot, it's got, it's clean. This one It does not look the same. So you had separate but equal, but this doesn't look equal to me. It's separate, but it doesn't look equal. So it's amazing that we had this going on in the United States where people were separated because of their color. Okay? It's just amazing that that happened. But through reforms, civil rights movements, other issues, we've come to today, which it's a lot better. So civil disobedience, is that protesting? Does it work? Would you or have you participated in any protests or civil disobedience? Is it illegal? Should it be? Is that the way to get things changed? Sometimes it is. Martin Luther King Jr., he is the biggest and brightest star of the Black Rights Movement. One thing about Martin Luther King Jr. is that he did not use any violence in his protests or his civil disobedience to get his message across. So there was civil disobedience, but it was lawful with Martin Luther King Jr. Many riots occurred between 1965 and 1967 in many cities because of African Americans wanting full and equal rights, not separate but equal rights. And this killed many people. This burned a lot of buildings and businesses, and it was a terrible time, similar to what happened earlier this year in Minnesota and other states because of protesting and riots as far as law enforcement was treating African Americans. So the rise of Black Power in 1966 considered Black nationalism. Some people consider that a racist group because of the nationalism title. If you have a white nationalist, some people say that's racist. So again, Black nationalism was looked at as racist, but it was just another movement, a form of civil disobedience to change the way things were for African Americans. The Nation of Islam is talked about, Black identity is talked about. Did the Nation of Islam unify or did it polarize the identity of blacks? That's a good question. Book talks about that. Did it unify them or did it polarize them? Malcolm X, if you ever seen the movie, if you haven't, I highly suggest you watch it. And Louis Farrakhan believed in black moral superiority. So they were very controversial, used very controversial tactics to get their message across, used civil disobedience. And you can read about the history of these two very political leaders and who had huge influences on the African American community. The BGF, the Black Guerrilla Family, is a prison gang. We'll talk more about that later in our chapters coming up. Basically, the prison gang is not your typical prison gang that wants to control drugs and money, but they're more so of the oppressed political gang in prison. And obviously, they are all African Americans, the Black Guerrilla Family. We'll talk about them a little bit. Okay, so African Americans today, book talks about this, the rise of the black middle class. Has it improved for everyone else? Because the middle class right now is going up, especially with the economy. But has it improved for African Americans also? But the book does, and which we'll talk about, one of the focus of the book is discrimination. Does discrimination still exist against African Americans? If so, where? Have you seen it? Have you experienced it? Have you ever heard of anybody that is a friend of yours that's African American that's been discriminated against? A lot of questions. Going to the history of treatment of African Americans in the criminal justice system, what do you think about that? Do you think they've been treated fairly? Is there any discrimination? Is there any disparity of treatment, a different treatment because of one's race of African Americans? What do we know? Book talks about a lot of stats, and the book concludes that African Americans are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system by all comparisons. The statistic, which is black and white, and I'm not a big statistics person, but statistically there's about 13% African Americans in the United States, 13%. But yet their incarceration rate is huge compared to that of other races. So African Americans are disproportionately incarcerated and involved in the criminal justice system than other races are. So that is a fact. And that is something that we'll be talking about and try to understand that and try to do something different so that does not occur. Police and African Americans, again, we know what happened with George Floyd and other African Americans a few months ago. When you look at the population versus police contacts, when 911 calls are they made from African American communities or other communities, Hispanic or Caucasian communities? What is the population that has contact with the police? If you have 13% of the African American population, yet they have the highest incarceration rate, then something's wrong there, and we need to figure out why. Why do police have more contacts with African Americans when they represent a less population? Do minorities think the police do a good job? Depends on what poll you look at. Some think they do fine, some don't think they do well at all. Some African Americans, or many in polls, don't call police because they know that it may take quite a while for them to get to their neighborhood. They may not even show up, and there may be other issues going on when an African American calls the police than someone else. Excuse me. As far as the courts and African Americans, there's some sentencing issues that go on. And basically, statistically, if you look at stats, again, not a big stat person, but I've seen this firsthand, that when the victim is white and the offender is an African American, there are usually harsher sentences when compared to a different circumstance with a black victim and a white perpetrator. So again, there's a lot of issues with sentencing. And remember we went over, or actually we haven't gone over that yet. So there's our sentencing guidelines, okay? Are they working? Back in the early 90s, there was federal laws that basically put people in prison for many years, 25 years or so, for having crack cocaine. And back in the 80s and early 90s, crack cocaine was historically and statistically more so used by African Americans for whatever reason. It had a very quick high, it was very cheap, easy to make, and so the African American community was heavily involved in the use of crack cocaine, as opposed to powder cocaine, which is more expensive, had less of a high, didn't last as long, and was used primarily by non-African Americans. Well, the issue was that the crack cocaine sentencing guidelines were totally different from the powder cocaine guidelines. So what that meant was that a person that was caught carrying, transporting, manufacturing, selling, using crack cocaine had a huge sentence that they would be facing as opposed to the powder cocaine sentence. So you had many African Americans put away for 20 years mandatory in the 90s for transporting or possessing crack cocaine, whereas if someone else was possessing or transporting powder cocaine, it would be maybe 3 to 6 years. So there's a huge discrepancy. Finally, a few years ago, the federal courts did act and took care of the sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine, because what it was very discriminatory toward African Americans because they were the ones historically, statistically, that used crack cocaine more so than white Americans. So there's a lot of disparity with that sentencing guideline. As far as corrections, statistically, African Americans are disproportionately incarcerated. There's other minority groups that are out there. What you might want to do is check some stats on death rows in the United States, on different states, and find out what the percentages are of who's on death row. Do you think it's more African Americans or Caucasians or Hispanic or Asians or others? You might want to look at that and see. Might interest you about other minority groups compared to whites as far as the death penalty. Again, this book suggests that blacks or African Americans are more likely to recidivate, to continue being involved in crime than other races. That's this book. I'm not sure if that's entirely correct. We'll talk more about that. Talking about prison reform, is that a form of upward social mobility for African Americans? And can the cycle of recidivism, of continuing to commit crimes, be broken by rehabilitation? Or does that mean job training? Or does that mean parent training? Or does that mean social training? How can this be broken, okay, for African Americans? The book does a good job about explaining this. We talked about the death penalty real briefly. Again, who's on death row in California today in the United States? Again, you might want to look at that, and it might surprise you. What I did was I did a little survey here, and in the United States right now, this is how many African Americans are on death row. That's how many Caucasian or white, Latino, national Americans, Native Americans. As you can see, there's a little bit more, not too much. So do you think this is discriminatory? These two numbers? Because those will change every month. What is discriminatory to me is disparity, is that if African Americans represent 13% of the population, that number is huge compared to this. So there's your disparity. 13%, yet there's most African Americans on death row. Think about that. What can you do to change that? These on the right is in California. Race, fear, and crime. Myth of a racist criminal justice system. Is it a myth or is it true? Do African Americans fear the criminal justice system? They probably do, because again, 13% of African Americans are highly represented in all aspects of it, which they should be represented less. Some self-fulfilling prophecies that the book talks about once in a while is the perception that I am a criminal, therefore I must act like a criminal, because everyone's saying that African Americans commit the most crimes, they're incarcerated the most. So this self-fulfilling prophecy starts out sometimes with young children, which is totally false. Okay, and again, when we look at African American surveys, what they say, is it a real heightened sense of hostility toward police, or is it imagined? To me, it probably would be real, since what's happening in the last few months and what's going on now with police reform, especially with the shooting of unarmed black males. What has been done for future issues? There's some legislation that's going on right now, which is supposed to retrain police, take away chokeholds, not give police immunity on cases where they kill or injure somebody. So there's a lot of police reforms that are going on for the better. Finally, we have some terminology for you. So you should know all of these terms, what they mean, just a very brief overview of what they mean, okay? And you can use these terms, and you should use these terms, in any papers that you have coming up, like your position paper that's due on Friday. You can use this information in any future papers that are coming up, or for any tests that we have coming up. So you should know what these terms mean. Okay, very important. Okay, anything else, let me know. Looking forward to your position papers on Friday. And again, if you have any questions, please put on the discussion board or just email me and I will answer you. Thank you. Have a great day.